In today's video, we're breaking down Valorant's roles and the purpose of each of them. What's going on, guys? It's your host Sergeant Frost, and welcome back to another episode of Noob to Pro. In this 5th episode, we'll be going over the different roles in Valorant, why they're so important, and how to play them optimally. Roles in Valorant are one of the most fundamental concepts, and having a good understanding of why they're so key can go a very long way when you're trying to get better. As always, timestamps will be below if you want to jump ahead or watch back any sections. So without further ado, let's get into it. So there's 4 roles in Valorant. You got duelists, initiators, controllers, and sentinels, and each of them have distinctly different jobs on a team. At the most basic level, where Valorant is a simple game of do we go A or B, the duelists would be the ones that go first. The initiators would use their abilities to make the duelists' lives easier, the controller will smoke off angles that are hard to deal with and that are unnecessary to take control of, and on the enemy team you would want to have a sentinel player that would defend the bomb site and try to field the hit. But that's obviously a huge simplification. So let's look at each of the roles a bit more in depth and break down what to do on each. First of all, there's initiators. Initiators are a type of support and they're arguably the strongest class in the game. They're crucial in finding information and setting up the team for success. Their abilities are of 2 types, either to put the enemies in worse positions by stunning, flashing, or otherwise disabling them, or they revolve around finding the enemies to help their teammates set up and deal with them. Take Sova for example. He has a recon dart which sends 3 pulses that reveal enemies, and he also has a drone that can scout out their positions. This means that as soon as his teammates enter the site, they know exactly where to look and how to approach it, all because of his information. But you also have an agent like Breach. He doesn't have any information-based utility, but he does have a stun that you can use on common angles, and he has flashes that might not find out where enemies are, but they will make sure their teammates have an easy enough time walking in regardless. And lastly, initiator hybrids like Skye. Skye has flashes that can blind opponents as well as give information, and she also has a controllable tiger that she can use to gain info too, as well as stun enemies if she hits them with it. Though unfortunately her trade-off for having both is that she does both styles less effectively than a pure flashing or a pure information initiator would. Different styles are better on different maps. On very large and open maps like Ascent, having a Sova or other information agent is good, but on more close-range maps like Fracture, Breach is a very good agent. Realistically though, having an initiator is never bad no matter what environment you're in. Regardless of map initiator, utility is always very powerful. It's absolutely crucial to take control of areas and sites, and realistically it only has one weakness, that being that it can't take an infinite amount of space. Take Ascent A for example. You can Sova drone out, clear all the corners and most of the site, but that doesn't stop anyone from peeking short and killing your teammates. As a Sova player, there's nothing you can do about that, so you're gonna need some help. And that help should come from the controllers. If we can take that same scenario as we just talked about and someone smokes the door as well as heaven, then suddenly the same Sova utility clears all of sight and the weaknesses of short is eliminated. Of course, opponents can still try to push these smokes and get ahead, but by doing that they open themselves up to a lot more danger, so there's a good chance they will go down without getting a single frag. Of course, that's not all the controllers are good for. They also offer huge value to their team by smoking off predominant entrances attackers normally take. On Ascent, that would be A main and B main. Plus, they can enable and aid both teams in taking mid control even outside of sites. If you want to push something aggressively as a defender like maybe mid, it can be super useful to have one or more areas smoked off so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so we got initiators to help set up fights, and we got controllers to patch up any weaknesses of our executes. What could possibly go wrong? Let's walk onto the site. Well, there's a few more things. But before we go over those, I should quickly let you guys know that we also offer guides and professional coaching over on our website ProGuides.com. For just $8 a month now, you can get access to everything we have to offer, even previous boot camps, so try it out today. Anyways, back on topic. Just one of those things that could maybe not go as planned is the existence of Sentinels on the enemy team. Sentinels are defensive specialists that can hold down entire areas with ease. They're good at stalling, and they can even get ratty little frags with little counterplay as possible. Say you drone out of main, all goes as planned and you spot the Cypher on Jet. You and your teammates try to run him down, or well at least until you run into a trip. His cage goes up and then you die right through. When you're planning against a good Sentinel, things like that can happen. Maybe you try to avoid them, but then again there's a good chance that you're going to run into a site that's stacked. So how do you deal with it? Well, a duelist would be a good start. Of course, a big part of countering Sentinels is just having awareness, knowing what they like to do, and then pre-firing or even using things like Sova's shock darts on common spots. But at the same time, having a duelist is really helpful, as their relatively selfish abilities allow them to do things that no other agent class can. In the previous scenario with the Cypher on Generator playing off his trip, Jet doesn't have to run at him. Instead, she can dash straight on top, giving him no chance to execute his play. And that's not just Jet. Raze can do the very same thing with her blast packs and nade. Phoenix's wall can break the trip straight up, and an agent like Neon has both stuns and the ability to close the gap quickly. So considering all of that, which role do you think is most important? For me, it's between controllers and initiators, as playing without either makes the game just so much more difficult. But what do you think? Make sure to comment down below. Alright, so it's pretty obvious what each role should do on their strongest sides and in the scenario of an execute. But of course, not every round you straight up go for a sight hit. And when you play a Sentinel to help on defense, how to use them on attack. So a Sentinel's role is to control space, which is super helpful on defense since you usually start with a lot. But it is surprisingly important on attack as well. When your team is going for a sight hit, it's important that no one is able to flank fast and get behind your team. So using your defensive utility to make sure that won't happen is usually a pretty good idea. But it's not just a Cypher Trip or Killjoy alarm bot that you can use to hold space. You can also put your own body on the line. If your team goes A, you as a Cypher player can choose to flank short. That way you can deny the enemies any potential flanks, while at the same time you add a huge threat of a backstab. So that way you can get some frags while the opponents are distracted by your team going into sight. Since your utility as a Sentinel player is not as crucial as say an initiators when you're trying to attack, you get a lot more freedom in your positioning. And by holding down this space in, for example, middle, you make sure that if your team gets stopped on their A hit early, they also have the ability to go back without having to take a very long clearing of all the angles again. And the same thing kind of goes for initiators. They're really good at taking control, which has an obvious use when you want to attack a site. But in the same way, holding space with the Sentinel is just not as important for defending bomb sites. Taking space isn't exclusive to sites either. You also need it for basic map control, like ascent mid, or things like A and B main, where otherwise a defender, maybe even with an operator, could challenge your team. Even on defense, initiator utility is super useful. It allows your team to push up to certain areas so that way they can get a good position or give your team more info on where the enemies are going. It'll enable your team to kickstart a retake since that's basically the same exact thing as a site take, just in reverse order and on a shorter clock. And it also keeps your team up to date on the latest plans of the enemy in the middle of rounds. Controllers we kind of already touched upon, but of course they are super useful to make doing those site takes a whole lot more difficult. Defending a site and rotating into one becomes a lot more doable as soon as the enemies are not able to see what's going on behind the smoke. Just think of the A site again. If your teammates call for help and you're approaching from heaven, it can be really difficult to go past that point. If you peek main, you can be exposed to as many as 3 enemies at once, giving you a very slim chance of surviving. But if the angle is smoked, well, no worries, you can peek heaven, you can jump down into sight, and you can even get close to main. Just pick your favorite position. Don't make too much noise getting there and you're golden. Even from the point of view of your opponents, it becomes a lot more risky to walk through now. In the scenario of no smoke, they can sort of isolate angles and use utility to clear out those close corners. But if there's a smoke, well, going through would mean they would expose themselves to everything at once, which is not only more risky, but also a lot more difficult since they really don't know where to look and how many enemies can be on site. And for the duelists, well, their X Factor type of playstyle that they use to frag out, they can use that on defense as well. If you're a good Reyna player, swinging through that door smoke can get you a single frag, and then you can use your dismiss to get out safely, whereas an Omen player would then just simply die. As a Jet, you can ready your dash, swing out heaven, get one frag and then dash out. Or if that's not how you like to play, you can post up early on main with an AWP, where you can even take a wider off angle with very little risk involved. If you're playing against a good defending duelist player, the question quickly becomes, how do we deal with them? Instead of the opponents having their own plan to play around, they now need to think about what you're doing and how they should go about countering it. And hopefully by the time they figure out the solution, well, you probably already come up with a new plan. So to summarize all of that, initiators are crucial when it comes to taking space in all scenarios, which includes not only taking and retaking sites, but also other important areas of the map that their utility can help a lot in. To keep you up to date on the positioning of your enemies, both on defense so that your team knows where to go, and also on attack so your team knows where not to go in case of a stack. Controllers make sure taking sites is actually possible, so that way there's no extremely dangerous areas that your team can't take control of, but your enemies can easily defend from, like door and heaven on A site. And at the same time, they're really effective at making pushing areas more difficult and risky, which is important on defense, but also in a scenario where your team has already planted the spike and needs to defend the site from the defenders retaking. Sentinels, on the other hand, are experts at keeping and controlling space, useful when you need to defend a site or an angle that's really hard to watch, but also important to make sure that your team doesn't get flanked and doesn't have to worry about enemies being in mid or very pushed up 20 seconds into the round. And then lastly, you have duelists, which are the true X factors of a team, and they are super dependent on the specific agent that they're playing. But what they all have in common is that they provide opportunities to bend the rules of the game. They can sometimes cross space very quickly like Jet, Raze, or Neon, allowing you to punish, for example, a Cypher on Generator or anywhere else. Or they provide you opportunities to get frags, and get saved from imminent death like a Phoenix Ultimate or a Reyna Dismiss. Their utility is generally quite selfish, but nevertheless valuable. And like any other role, not having them on your team complicates everything quite a bit. Always try to have at least one agent on every role and play to those agents' strengths. Then you'll see yourself having a lot more success rather quickly. That's all for now. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. This has been your host Sergeant Frost, and I'll see you all again in the next episode.